Mark Regev, thank you very much for joining us on Bloomberg Television. From the recent intelligence reports that you've seen, is this ceasefire going to hold?
I can't give you an unequivocal answer. In the recent operation, we hit Hamas very hard. We hit their military machine in a way that it is today crippled, but they still have potential to hit us. And we've said clearly, if they start another round of fighting, we will hit back powerfully. We have no interest in another conflict with Gaza, but if they initiate fighting, it will end on our terms, not on theirs.
What about the visit from the U.S. Secretary of State? Did they pressure or offer any incentives to resume peace negotiations with the Palestinians? And is there perhaps a glimmer of hope on that front?
Maybe just a glimmer. We're interested in resuming dialogue with the Palestinians, but it won't be easy. And first and foremost, we've got to make sure that this ceasefire stays in place and is sustained. Hamas, as you know, is not the Palestinian Authority. Hamas is opposed to any sort of reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians. Hamas says the only solution is the destruction of Israel. Their words, not mine. They believe any Arab leader who makes peace with Israel is a traitor to the Palestinian cause and to Islam. They say an Arab leader who makes peace with Israel should be killed. They'll in fact kill them themselves. So Hamas is a major problem here. We can't.
That may be the case in your view, Mark. But what did the U.S. Secretary of State communicate in terms of whether or not the Biden administration is willing to steer, willing to lead a wider peace negotiation efforts beyond just this ceasefire?
But on my point about Hamas, the Secretary of State was very clear. Hamas is a terrorist organization that we don't talk to. We deter them. We want to make them understand that it's not in their interest to shoot rockets into Israel and try to murder our civilian population. But vis-a-vis the Palestinian Authority, of course, we're interested in having a more positive relationship. We want to move forward. There are things that they need to do. The Americans want us also to do. Take some steps. We're willing to pay to move forward in that process.
So there weren't any incentives offered by the U.S. administration around this issue?
It's a matter of conversation, not about incentives. No one has to tell Israel that we need to have peace. We want to have peace. We want to be on good terms with all our nations. I'd remind you that over the past few months, we've had actually dramatic advancements in the peace process. We've had peace relations with 4 Arab countries, 2 in the Gulf, Bahrain and the Emirates. And in Africa, we've had a breakthrough with Sudan and with Morocco. And I think there are more Arab countries on the way, and we'd like to see the process move forward with the Palestinians too.
Yeah.
As President Biden said, and I'm sure you heard his words, he said peace demands that they finally recognize the legitimacy of the independent Jewish state of Israel. Without that, there can be no peace.
I mean, this is not just about Gaza anymore. You look at the 3 fronts that Israel is fighting on. You've got Hamas in Gaza, you've got the Palestinians across the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and then you have Palestinians with Israeli nationality. What does a policy reset in Israel need to look like to adapt to this new reality, Mark?
Well, first of all, let's look at each one of those issues separately. With Hamas in Gaza, I think the best we can hope for in the short term is deterrence, to deter them, to prevent them from shooting rockets into Israel. That's a major achievement. That's good for Israel. That's good for the Palestinians in Gaza. No one wants to see another round of fighting. And as I said, if they start another round of fighting, we'll finish it on our terms. But we're not interested in escalation. We'd like to see this calm prevail. Vis-a-vis Palestinians on the West Bank, we've negotiated with them in the past. And we can negotiate with them in the future. We'd like to see the peace process move forward. But once again, it isn't just dependent on Israel. In peace, you need 2 to tango. And up until now, the Palestinian Authority has not been open to negotiate with Israel, has not been open to some sort of reconciliation with Israel. We hope they change their policies. If you mentioned,
that's what, I mean, it takes 2 to tango. So as much as you say that there's not enough of an effort underway on the Hamas and Palestinian Authority side, there are plenty of arguments to be built around that more needs to be done on the Israeli side domestically and in terms of foreign policy.
So domestically, I'm not sure what Israel's internal policies. We're a democracy. We've had elections. We might be having another election. Israel is a vibrant, robust democracy, the only one in the region, as you know well, the only democracy in the Middle East. Independent judiciary, free press, a very vibrant political culture, a robust democracy, if I can say. And Arab Israelis play a full part in that process, as you know from the last elections. Arab parties could be crucial in any future government coalition. We have to wait and see. But once again, how is that related to our relations with our neighbors, except to say that I wish our neighbors also had the blessings of democracy that we have here in Israel?
I mean, you talk about a vibrant democracy, and there could definitely be a few questions around that. You're talking about what, the fourth election that's turned out to be inconclusive in about 2 years. The prime minister has bought himself some time with this latest conflict with Hamas, but ultimately, are we looking at a fifth election, and how do we get out of this vicious cycle?
So first of all, I don't know. I do know this for a fact, that my prime minister and the government of Israel did everything it could to avoid the recent escalation. I even remember at the beginning of the week when this process went into escalation, we took a number of steps in Israel designed specifically to try to reverse a negative cycle, and we were praised for it by the United States government. We specifically took steps that were difficult for Israelis. We rerouted the annual Jerusalem Day Parade. We asked Jewish people not to go up to the Temple Mount, even though the status quo allows them to. And of course, we asked the courts, in a very rare interference between the executive branch and the judiciary, we asked them to postpone their decision on the Sheikh Jarrah housing dispute.
Right, but that wasn't
because we wanted to de-escalate.
That wasn't my question, Mark. My question was around the fifth election and whether we're going to break through the vicious cycle in domestic Israeli politics.
So I can't answer that. I mean, this might be the land of the Bible, but I'm no prophet, sir, and I don't know what will be. I do know this, that to say that Israel has had too many elections, you can make most Israelis would probably agree with that, but we are a vibrant democracy. Our elections prove that. Anything to the contrary is simply not correct.
What about the Iron Dome system? We understand that that's been promised to the Gulf. Has there been any more progress on that conversation with your U.S. counterparts?
I can say the following, that Iron Dome once again proved itself to be a very, very successful anti-missile system. It shot down 92% of all the incoming rockets fired by the terrorists in Gaza. Without Iron Dome, we would have had many more casualties on the Israeli side, and I dare say we would have had more casualties on the Palestinian side too, because without the ability to defend our civilian population through that system, through that missile defense system, we would, of course, had to have gone in, probably send ground forces in, and it would have been greater casualties on both sides, both the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. We thank the Americans because they're a partner in the Iron Dome program. It's Israeli technology, but with a lot of American support. And as you heard, President Biden and the administration have agreed to replace our stockpiles of interceptors to make sure that if there is another round of fighting, we can defend the Israeli civilian population as we did in this recent round of fighting. And we are very thankful and grateful to the Americans for their support for this important defensive project.
So do we have a date then for that replenishment yet?
I think it's an ongoing process. And
who in the Gulf is going to get the Iron Dome system first? Who's first in line?
I think with your permission, we don't talk about these things publicly. We're talking about defense deals that may or may not happen.
Okay, so maybe you'll tell me offline then. All right, what about the ongoing discussions around a re-engagement with Iran, around bringing them back into the fold, a potential breakthrough in a nuclear deal? Israel is opposed to that. What steps is the country taking to derail progress on that front? What have you told Mr. Blinken?
Well, my prime minister said very clearly when the Secretary of State was here that we think it would be a mistake to return back to the 2015 deal. We think that deal actually gives Iran a clear path to nuclear weapons with international legitimacy. And we believe, as I say, to return to that deal would be a mistake. And in saying so, I don't think we're just expressing the position of the Israeli government. I think many of our friends in the region, many Arab countries, especially in the Gulf, share Israeli concerns about that nuclear deal. First and foremost, it didn't solve the nuclear issue in itself. And secondly, it unfortunately gave the Iranian regime access to resources by the lifting of the sanctions. They had a lot more money to spend on Hamas, on Islamic Jihad, on Hezbollah, in Syria, in Yemen. In other words, it allowed them to bankroll their aggression across the region. we think there should be pressure on the Iranian regime until they change their policies.
What about the normalization accords? The recent conflict in Gaza arguably has muddied the perception of the breakthrough with Israel around the Gulf countries. Popular backlash that, you know what, this is actually not in the interest of the Palestinians at this point in time. Does that mean that that makes it a lot more difficult to reach any new deals, say with Saudi Arabia or with some of the other Arab countries?
I have no doubt that when we're fighting a war against Hamas in Gaza, that can cause tension, that can cause issues in our relations with our Arab partners. But if you look at the issue more seriously, we had a situation, I think, where there was understanding for the way Israel was behaving in large parts of the Arab world. I'd remind you that Hamas is not just classified a terrorist organization in Israel and the United States and in other Western countries, but many Arab countries also officially designate Hamas a terrorist organization. And I've even heard now from what the Secretary of State, Blinken, has been doing to try to get support for the construction of Gaza. Even Arab partners say, yes, we're willing to help, but we'll have nothing to do with Hamas. And they, like Israel, want guarantees that funds that will go to the reconstruction of Gaza won't go to help beef up the Hamas regime.
Mark, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much for the time. That's Mark Regev there. He's a senior advisor to the Prime Minister of Israel.
Thank you for having me, sir.